Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first in the RISS community series for 2021. We're delighted to have a number of students joining us here and sharing the series also on YouTube Live now. So the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon has a long tradition of bringing people together from around the world to work on very important topics. And through this series, we're going to engage you in the research that's going on in this community. The Carnegie Mellon Robotics Institute has a tremendously large and diverse faculty, student, and staff investigating and applying robotics to a number of areas. So we're delighted that you are joining us here today. We have students from 27 different countries, and we're just really thrilled to have this opportunity together. I'd like to especially welcome our new partners with IEEE RISS, Chile. And if you were here a little bit earlier, you saw that RISS is really a global program. We've hosted students from over 50 home countries. And we're looking forward to expanding that and giving more opportunities to students. So my name is Rachel Burson. I'm Global Programs Manager at the Robotics Institute, and I serve as the co-director of RISS. I'd like to welcome John Dolan, and Professor Dolan is the director of RISS and a principal system scientist. John, would you like to introduce all of that?
Yes, I'd be glad to do that. Thanks, Rachel. It's my pleasure to briefly introduce Oliver Kromer, my colleague in the Robotics Institute. Oliver has a depth of understanding and expertise in manipulation, and particularly the application of learning to manipulation. And I believe that that's what he's going to principally talk about today. He also is very strongly involved with education, and I'm very appreciative of his involvement in the Master's in Robotic Systems Development program, where he teaches the robot autonomy course and has helped out a lot with our admissions process over the years. And he runs a great lab where I know his students appreciate him very much. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Oliver.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, thank you all for inviting me to this. Always very excited to be talking to the RISS students, getting your questions, and obviously presenting some of the work that's being done in my lab. So I'm going to be talking about structuring manipulation tasks for more efficient learning. So I'm, as John already mentioned, I'm at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm the head of the Intelligent Autonomous Manipulation Lab. And our focus really is on developing AI methods for robots to perform advanced manipulation tasks. So in the future, we want robots that can be deployed in a variety of different scenarios. We want robots that can help out in hospitals and restaurants, that can perform, basic household chores, support the elderly. Even in areas such as manufacturing, where we already see quite a few robots, we want to see how we can sort of, push that further, push it into more sort of small scale adaptive kind of manufacturing. We want robots that can work together with humans and even help out in hazardous environments. And so what we really need to do is we need to develop robots that are capable of performing robust and versatile manipulation skills. So these are skills that allow the robots to change the state of their surroundings, so manipulate the state, but that are also reliable in the way that they approach problems, either reliable in themselves, the skill, or if they make a mistake, that they can recover from that. So that's really the robustness side. And versatility is really this idea that we want a robot to be able to learn something in one situation and be able to generalize that to a variety of different tasks and situations. So if we learn how to grasp a specific kind of object, we want to be able to generalize that to other objects as well. And so, if we can achieve that, we can have robots working in these very complicated, unstructured kind of environments, performing a lot of great tasks to support people. So obviously the question then is, how do we actually, break down that big problem? How do we, take these sort of complicated environments and make them actually manageable? And that's really what the talk's going to be about today. So here we have a Pier 2 robot that's trying to perform a cooking task, right? So looking at this, we can always tell it's trying to cut some cucumbers, but it's not the most easy environment. There's a bunch of other objects in the world around it. And so the first thing that we need to think about is really the scope, right? If we're trying to learn a cutting skill, there's a lot of things in unstructured environments that are not going to be relevant, that we don't need to learn about, so that we can really focus on the most relevant parts of these kinds of manipulations. Oh, okay. Sorry, just looking at the chat. All right, so the first problem is really bringing it down to the right scope. Another way that we can sort of address the complexity of the real world is by looking at modularity, right? So rather than just saying, this is one monolithic scene, we can actually break it down into individual objects. We can look at parts of objects. Here, we have the knife, but we also have the food item. And, if we start using this sort of, modularity of breaking it down into individual components, then we can start reasoning about, cutting this food item versus cutting another food item, right? Maybe we, also reasoning about our hands. Maybe we can, use our left hand to perform the cutting versus our right hand, breaking it down and sort of being able to reuse individual components of these skills using this sort of modularity. The third thing we're going to talk about, and the third really key aspect to sort of making this problem accessible, is interactions. So one of the great things about robots is that they can actually interact with their surroundings. They can, try out different things. They can perform tests through their manipulation skills, and they can actually see how the world reacts to that. And that can provide, very useful information. So, maybe in this case, these two bell peppers or actual bell peppers, this is a cucumber, but this is actually a plastic toy, right? And so maybe visually, if we just look at the scene, that's difficult to see. But if we start actually interacting with that and with our environment and exploring it, then we can actually get this additional information and use that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use that, and especially vibrations in terms of learning more about our environment. To begin with, we're going to jump right into the middle of this actually and start off with modularity. Right. So modularity is really the question of how do we break down the problem into smaller pieces that we can reuse across different situations and different tasks. And there's a lot of modularity in robotics and robot learning. So I always like to think about objects in terms of hierarchy, right? So we have here, for example, a cup. And we can break it down into its individual parts. So we have the opening of the cup, we have the handle of the cup, we have the side of the cup, and we have the bottom of the cup, right? And each of those we could potentially break down further into individual points that sort of capture that geometry, right? And so, for these points, it might be that we want to pour around a certain location. Well, then we can think about any of these points as, a potential pouring location, maybe not at the handle, but, all the other ones. But we can also think about, other kinds of objects. So if we learn how to grasp a handle, if we can, find another similar looking handle on a completely different object, then we can reuse that kind of information to generalize across different objects with similar handles. And so, we can see this kind of deconstruction of objects into two parts and sort of being able to sort of interchange parts between different objects. We can also see this on the skill level, right? So if we have a skill, so we want a robot to make me lunch, maybe specifically a sandwich, then there's certain steps that's going to have to go through, such as slicing off a piece of bread. Maybe has to slice off two slices of bread. Take out the cheese, take out the salami. And we can sort of, look at that as sort of a hierarchy of different skills. So here we have these what are known as policies or skills in our case, which we can break down into smaller pieces. So, if we need to perform the, like a slice of cheese, then, one step of this making a sandwich is to actually perform that cheese slicing. And that one we can break down further into actually grasping the knife, right? And if we have, grasping is obviously going to be something that's going to appear multiple places in this kind of a hierarchy. And so many of these kind of skills that we have when we break down a problem to smaller pieces can be reused throughout that hierarchy. Now, in this case, what we have is this sort of sequential, behavior where we can break it down, but ultimately we're kind of performing one skill after another, right? We've got grasping a knife, we've got placing a slice, but we're kind of performing, these in a sequence. What I'm going to talk about today is actually looking at how we can perform multiple sort of subtasks in parallel. So imagine that you're trying to screw in a screwdriver, right? There's actually certain constraints that we need to be able to enforce while we're doing this task. So we may need to be able to reach for the tip of the screwdriver to the screw, but we also need to be able to align the screwdriver with the axis of the screw, right? So that's a nice suitable insertion. Similarly, once we actually start screwing in the screw, we need to make sure that we're applying a sufficient amount of force onto the screw. We still need to maintain that alignment throughout, right? The one that we had before. But in this case, we also maybe want to add an additional behavior, which is the rotating, right? And so we can often sort of look at manipulation skills as kind of consisting of these sort of low-level controllers that we want to combine, right? So many of these subtasks are going to be sort of object-centric. So, we have to consider the orientation of the screw, the position of the screw, how much force to apply along that axis. We can see how in some cases, such as aligning, these are going to be sort of shared between different parts of the task, but other parts are going to be sort of unique or novel to that specific skill, right? So for example, the rotating or generally just the reaching to that location. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to sort of break down the problem into these sort of single axes object-centric controllers. So rather than just thinking about a skill as sort of a monolithic component, we wanted to have these individual controllers that are sort of being presented by the environment as things that we can do with the environment, and then actually learn to select multiple of these controllers and use them together to create an actual skill, such as reaching for a screw or screwing in the screw. So how can we do that? So here we have a simple toy example. We have this red block here. We have our green block here, which is actually our robot. So this can sort of execute different kinds of behaviors in this environment. And we have a library of skills. So for this talk, we're going to assume that these kind of low-level libraries have been provided. We have been working recently on actually identifying them autonomously from the environment. But for now, let's just assume that we have a library of controllers that we can use to perform manipulations. Right. So for example, here we have two position controllers, either to go to the corner here or to the middle of the wall. We also have a force controller to push on this red object, or a force controller to move, to push down towards this bottom wall. So let's imagine that our task is to actually move this red block up to this top corner. So in that case, what we want to do is we want to sort of choose a couple of controllers that allow us to do that, right? So the first one is obviously we want to make sure that that red block maintains contact with the wall. And so we want to have our 0th priority, so the highest priority actually, controller being a force controller pushing against that object, right? We also want to make sure that we actually move towards that top corner. So our second controller that we might choose is this position controller that's going to move us up to that location. Now, if we just naively executed both of these controllers in parallel, what would happen? Well, we'd be adding a certain amount of force because for this first controller, but we'd also be adding additional force on the object as we're trying to sort of move up towards that corner there along this axis. So if we just perform both of these actions together, we're actually going to apply more force than we want to on that object because of those sort of interactions between the controllers. So what we do instead is we use a hierarchical control approach, which is to say that we project the lower priority one, so this one controller, into the null space of the higher priority controller. So in this case, we sort of remove all the components of this first controller, sorry, the one controller, which is sort of aligned with that first axis. And now we actually have a behavior that is going to apply that desired force to maintain contact, and then also slide the object up to that corner, okay, without those two controllers actually interacting with each other. We can do something very similar for rotations. So we can effectively look at sort of aligning individual axes, and then also looking at aligning a second axis within the null space of that first one. But I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we can also do that for the rotations, and we'll see in the videos that we are doing some alignment there as well. So when we have this sort of setup with the library of object-centric controllers, we have, a way to actually combine these controllers so that they're, that they sort of complement each other rather than interfere with each other. What we really still need is a way of actually selecting which controllers to actually use, right? So we want to be able to sort of create this prioritized list of potential controllers and choose the ones, that are going to be most beneficial first, and then less priority, the ones that are going to still help out with creating that skill. Now, if we do this in a sort of a naive approach, we get sort of this combinatoric explosion of possible controllers, right? So let's say that we have an environment that affords us 20 different controllers, and we want to create a skill consisting out of 3 controllers. So if we sort of just naively take every single combination there, we already get about 7,000 combinations, and trying to learn which of those 7,000 combinations is the right one at every point is actually very difficult. So, if we sort of break it down like that, there's not a lot of sort of sharing of information, which is, what we really want to do for more efficient learning. So the way that we approach this is by, rather than trying to select all the controllers at the same time, we actually break down the problem into multiple steps where we select a controller at every single sort of step along this. Okay, so what this means is that, rather than choosing, all 3 controllers, C1, C2, and C3, we're first going to choose C1. And, based on that, we're going to be able to compute, how valuable is this controller. We can sort of start creating estimates of, generally, was that a good choice or not? And then based on that first choice, we're going to choose our C2, right? So it might be that if we choose a certain C1, there's a certain C2 that complements it. And if we choose another C1, then another C2 is going to work well with that. So we can kind of capture that in making this sort of an expanded MDP where we choose each of the controllers sequentially rather than at the same time. And so actually breaking this problem down to this way allows us to sort of create some more information sharing between the different kinds of controllers. So, if we know that a certain controller that we chose at the beginning is just completely horrible for this task, then we don't need to think about every single combination of C2 and C3 with that. We can just kind of, sort of say, okay, we're not going to use that. To actually train the network then that's going to predict which controllers we should use, we use a fairly standard reinforcement learning algorithm known as proximal policy optimization, or PPO. So if we look at the evaluations, so we sort of looked at different ways of representing our actions. So one of them was to sort of break down these sort of the choice of controllers into a sequence, which corresponds to these last 2 columns here. The difference being that one of them, there's just a slight difference in sort of how we represent the controllers we've already selected so far between each execution step. But we also compare to just having sort of, the combinations of different controllers, simply selecting, the top 3 controllers without any consideration about the other ones, selecting one controller and just trying to perform the task directly in the sort of low-level action space without these controllers at all. And as you can see from these results, so we looked at, fitting up this green block into the slot, sliding this red block up this wall, and inserting and rotating an Allen key, as well as opening a door. In all the cases, we do find the most reliable performance is achieved by using sort of, these modular controllers where we select them one after another and sort of share information between that selection process. We can also see this on the real robot. So here you can see a robot that's now learned how to open up a door. So you can see that the learning curve, in purple is ours. So we learn faster than, for example, the one controller. You can actually perform this task with just executing one controller at the same time. But using these controllers definitely, allows for a lot more structured search of the robot as well. So if we just try to sort of perform this task, naively in the low dimensional, in the low level controller space, then it's very difficult for it to even figure out how to reach the door, and so in that case we generally don't learn. We can also see this working with the hex key task, so inserting and screwing. Here we're generalizing also between different sizes of tools that we're using, and again you can see that we quickly get a success rate close to 1. Whereas, with a combinatoric approach that struggles a lot more, ends up about a 70% success rate. And with the one controller is very low, because in this case, you do actually need to push down on the object while rotating it. And, trying to sort of constantly switch between those isn't going to work. So the key message from this part of the talk, I would say, is this idea of trying to sort of take the problems that you have and break them down into smaller parts that you can reuse multiple times. And this could be sequentially, as I mentioned, but in this case particularly, we're interested in also sort of parallel kinds of controllers and merging those to create those skills that we need to manipulate the environment. So the next part of the talk is going to be looking at scope, right? So this is how do we actually take this complicated environment and sort of focus in on really the important things for learning. Okay, so it's really about addressing the question of when and what to learn. So the first project I'm going to talk about is looking at using patches to using skills to patch models. So often in robotics, we're going to be using planners in order to plan different motions to get to different locations in our environment. We can also use planners to actually perform manipulation tasks. And these work incredibly well as long as we actually have a suitable model, right? So if our predictions about what's going to happen are correct, then we can sort of plan the right actions, execute them, and then that's going to work well. Learned skills have the great benefit of actually being able to adapt to, based on our experiences. So, through trial and error, we can sort of, or demonstrations, we can acquire these skills, but they do require data. So the idea is really to, rely on the planners as much as possible, but then also use the learned skills as needed. So I always like to think of it as sort of this diagram down here. So we have our state space. So this is, all the different situations that the robot might encounter. So where the robot is, where the objects are. And there's going to be a large region where our model is actually going to work, but there's also going to be a region here shown in green where our model fails, right? So if we try to plan through that green region a path, then that's just going to lead to a failure because the world's not going to be, behave the way that we expected it to. So instead of trying to, learn the complexity of that world and those kind of situations, we've been looking at actually trying to learn skills that can sort of robustly get us to sort of goal states in those regions without having to capture those models. Okay, so we're going to be looking at actually, identifying when our model breaks down and then learning skills for completing the tasks from there. So the way that we do this, we have a training phase and a testing phase. So in the training phase, we start off as one would expect. We have our model, we have our planner. You can see here the robot's trying to create a plan for inserting this sort of pink block into the pink slot. In this case, it's a dark block into a black slot. But we can run this planner, and once we have a plan, we can start executing it. And if everything goes as planned, fantastic. We just complete the task. However, we are constantly looking for detecting deviations between what we expect to happen and what actually does happen in the real world. So whenever we predict the object going to move to a certain state and it doesn't do that, we can sort of flag that an error has occurred. And for this task, there's a variety of errors that can happen, especially as we get very close to these sort of the slot, so we can get the handle could get twisted. We might have a translational misalignment or an orientation misalignment. And what happens then is that we're going to take that as data for predicting in the future when our model is going to fail. So we're going to train a classifier for predicting model failure. And we're also going to request a demonstrations for learning a skill. So with this demonstration, the person's going to bring us to a certain, first bring the robot to a state, which is the precondition, so a location where it can actually execute the skill, and then it's going to actually, the person's going to actually show the skill for the robot to learn from. At test time, we're again going to, use our planner to create a trajectory. We're going to then use that classifier that we learned during training to identify if we're going through any states where our model is going to fail. If there isn't any problems, then we can just execute it. However, if we do detect that there are going to be errors, then we're going to replan In particular, rather than trying to go directly to the goal, we're going to try to go to those skill preconditions using our planner. And then from those skill preconditions, we can execute our learned skill and then perform the actual successful insertion. So here you can see that the training phase, the robot picks up the object. It kind of detects that there's an error there. So now someone's taking over with a joystick, moving the robot to a better starting location for the skill, and then demonstrating this insertion skill. And at test time, it's detected, I mean, at this point, it's already planned its trajectory. It's identified that, there's going to be a problem if it tries to go directly to the goal. And so instead, it's just going to focus on, going to that precondition and then executing the skill from there. And we can see that, using this kind of approach of combining model-based planning and experience-based learning, we can get a very high success rate using actually very little data. So one of the great things about this project was really seeing how small of a scope the learning actually had to focus on, because the planner was covering most of the situations already. It was really only when that model broke down very close to the goal state that we had to switch over to a learning-based approach. And so something to think about always is sort of that interaction between those two, the planning and the model-based reasoning and the learning approaches, and sort of playing to both of their strengths. One example I also really like is the door example. So for the door example, in this case, we had a student actually design a very good model, it turns out, and it could effectively just use the planner to directly open the door. So in this case, it pretty much learned on its own that, or figured out on its own that it doesn't need to get a demonstration. It can perform this task for this door, at least on its own, using the model it had. So as someone who works in robot learning, it's always nice when the robot says, that's okay, I don't need to actually learn that. The next project I want to kind of talk about is actually thinking about, what do we want to learn? So we talked about situations when we want to learn, but there's also the question of what we want to learn and what is actually relevant to this learning process, right? So when you think about the environment that you're in right now, you can probably look around. There's going to be lots of different objects in that environment. But if you want to do something very simple, so for example, picking up an object, or maybe stacking it on another object, there's only going to be a very small amount of objects that are going to be relevant to performing that task, right? Many objects, they're just in the scene, but you don't really need to consider them. And we take that kind of for granted, but for robots, they're just in the environment, they see a lot of objects. If they incorporate all that in their state, then they're going to start thinking about, well, maybe I have to place it a little bit different because of the color of the wallpaper, right? There's not that sort of that intuition about what's actually relevant for the task and what's not relevant. And so we looked at this problem as follows. So we have some kind of a skill. We have some skill parameters at theta, and we're trying to predict what those parameters should be for a given situation, okay, or a given context, as we like to call it. Now, the context variables, if we were sort of go for the naive approach, we can kind of just take all the features of our environment, so the locations of objects, their sizes, and just put everything inside of that vector, and just hope that we can train some kind of a neural network that will hopefully figure out what's important, what's not. The problem is obviously if you have changes in the environment or you don't have rich enough data, then you are going to get these sort of spurious correlations in there, which might hinder your performance later on. So what we want to do is we want to identify just those features of the environment that are actually relevant for this task. Okay, so identifying pretty much those objects and their features that we should be focusing on for learning this mapping from the environment to the skill parameters. All the other context variables, we can kind of say, okay, they shouldn't have an influence at this point. We're also going to talk a little bit, once we have that general mapping from the relevant context variables, we can often break it down a little bit further. So it might be that, if I'm talking about a parameter that's the horizontal movement of my hand, then maybe I only need to consider the horizontal position of the objects that are going to be relevant for that. But ultimately, what we want to do here is we want to determine the structure of the network. In particular, what are the relevant inputs to that network so that we can get efficient and robust learning. And to do this, we're going to assume that the robot has a very simple internal model of the task. So often it's very, it's difficult to get a very accurate model, but often it's very easy to get a simple model of the environment. So here we see, some kind of a geometric model of different blocks. And this is kind of the same way that we can kind of imagine the world around us as humans. And we can use that kind of internal model for actually doing some causal reasoning. Okay, so the idea is that we want to use that internal model to sort of reason about variations in the environment and which kind of variations are going to be important and which ones are not. And we're going to do that using causal interventions. So let's imagine we have a block stacking task shown here. So we have 3 objects. The goal is to place the red one on the blue one. And we're trying to figure out which of these objects are actually relevant. So what we can do is we can just think about a specific context to begin with. So here we have specific heights, we have specific positions, and it's very easy to sort of identify what those parameters should be for actually solving the problem in that specific context. Okay, so in this case, there's a certain height we should go up, we should go across, and we should go down. The challenge usually with manipulation is not sort of those individual contexts, it's about generalizing across contexts, right? And so what we're going to do now to figure out what's relevant is we're going to start performing causal interventions. So for example, we could move this red block to the side and see, does this affect performance, right? So we've moved the location of the orange block. If we internally run that same kind of behavior, we see that the task still succeeds, everything is fine, same performance. So this exposition of this orange block is not going to be relevant. Okay, so we can kind of disregard the exposition. If we do a different kind of intervention, so for example, we change the height of the blue block, now we do actually see that we get a drop in performance. The task is actually going to fail according to our internal model, and therefore we can reason about the y height of this object actually being relevant. Okay, and so we can go through each one of our sort of context variables, perform these causal interventions on them, and use that to identify which of the features are going to be relevant or not. The second phase is looking at actually, which of these features are relevant for which of our skill parameters. So for example, here we might have a parameter indicating how far up we go, how much we go to the side, how much we go down at the end. And again, we're going to start off with that specific context that we've solved. And now we're going to, again, perform a causal intervention. So we're going to change our exposition of this blue block. And obviously, in this case, it's going to fail. We know that already. But what we're going to do now is we're going to resolve the problem. Okay, so given this new context where we've changed this one variable, what is the new set of parameters that can solve that, right? And so we might get a behavior shown here. So it's a little bit higher up. It's obviously a little bit more to the right. And this is going to solve the problem. And so, the fact that these variables changed is an indication that, they are going to be relevant. However, we can also see that, we've changed the height of this, but we didn't actually have to change that, right? So what we do is we actually search through the different changes that we have there, from theta to theta dash, and we find a minimum set of changes that we can sort of perform that will solve that task for the new context. So in this case, moving further to the right, that was relevant. However, changing the height of that wasn't actually necessarily. So for actually, in terms of the delta x parameter, we don't need to use that as an input for figuring out the height. We just need to use it as an input for the horizontal movement. Okay, and so performing that kind of a causal reasoning allows us to sort of infer sort of individual mappings of which context variables are relevant for each one of our skill parameters. So we evaluated this, first of all, in simulation, starting with a block stacking task. So the idea is always to take one of the blocks, stack it on another one. We have changes in the color, the positions, the heights of the objects. We also looked at a crate opening task. So in this case, there's a door with a handle on it that the robot has to open up. There's also a bunch of objects sort of inside of the crate, although they're not actually that relevant to the task. But they do obviously increase the state space if the robot sort of does this naively, right? And we want the robot to be able to identify these kind of relevant state variables or context variables without having to rely on a human to sort of say, ignore all the blocks in the box. So here you can see the results. So we have the 3 different kinds of approaches, right? So the naive full network, we have the reduced input network, and we have what we know as the partitioned one, so where we have individual mappings for each one of the skill parameters. And I think that the key takeaway here is really looking at the zero-shot transfers. So these are ones where the robot has effectively trained in its internal simulation a network, and it's now trying to apply it in the real world. And what we see is that, if we have our 10 different trials, so 10 out of 10 times, the partitioned one, so the one that has the most structure, actually succeeded the most. The reduced one also had a fairly good performance with 7 out of 10, so 70%. Whereas sort of the direct, the naive approach only got about 40%. And this is sort of when the target and the the training domain were very similar. If we add additional changes, so we move the objects to a different part of the state space, which the robot was not familiar with, we see that these are a little bit stronger actually results. So in that case, the MLP completely didn't work, zero shot, because effectively, it sort of thought, oh, this object over here, even though it's irrelevant, it moved, I should still change my behavior based on that. And so, by sort of providing this additional structure or having the robot discover this additional structure, it can actually learn these behaviors much more robustly. And we see very similar behavior kind of with the crate opening. So again, having that sort of reduced structure tends to allow for more efficient training. So it's, it focuses on the relevant components, and it's also more robust when we have changes between the internal model and the real world, in this case, the simulation. We also tried this on a real robot, as you can see here. So in this case, I forgot to update the title. So this is actually, we finished these experiments, but here we have the full context. So this is the naive one. So, it seems very trivial to sort of pick up an object and stack it on another one. But, here on the partitioned one, so our approach, it sort of identified the fact that, it is the location of the yellow block and the blue block that's important. Whereas this full context one, it kind of messes up because it's trying to reason about all these other objects in the world and, what kind of influences they might have. So, simply changing, the position of the green block a little bit is going to affect the actual policy behavior. All right. Yes, so for modularity, really the takeaway, for scope, the takeaway was, try to reduce the scope of the problems as much as possible, use different tools that are available in terms of interventions and models, and also, the human when available. So I'm running out of time. I'm going to quickly go through the last part of the talk, looking at the interactions, because I think there are some sort of fun things to talk about here. In particular, we wanted to answer the question, how to get the most out of good vibrations. So when we talk about manipulation tasks, it's very important that we think about the idea of manipulation modes. So, we only have a certain amount of muscles in our body. There's only so many forces that we can exert. And so it's very important that we can go between different kinds of states in the environment where we can sort of influence different objects. And these are kind of known as manipulation modes. And so, for example, each one of these blocks corresponds to a different mode. So in this case, we can't manipulate the object at all. Here we can start applying forces to it once we've pinched it. Either we can sort of start sliding that object, or if we apply enough upward force, we can sort of break the contact and actually move it around in space. So modes are really important because they provide a lot of structure to manipulation tasks. So, if you're trying to pick something up, this transition here might be seen as a sub-goal, whereas this transition here might be an error because that's, scraping the object. While, if we're trying to actually scrape it, then suddenly this one becomes a sub-goal and this one becomes an error. An important part about these manipulation goals, though, is also that they provide a lot of sensory information, in particular, a lot of vibration information. So when we make contact, when we break contact, when we have sliding contact, we actually create additional vibrations which we can sense. Okay, and this has been very well studied also in sort of humans and grasping. But we want to talk about cutting. So one of our projects actually looked at identifying when these different contact events happen, when we're actually performing a cutting task. In this case, we have these sort of microphones on the back of the knife and on the back of the tongs, and the robot's using those to actually detect when it first makes contact with the object and when it also starts scraping against that cutting board. So it knows that it's actually cut all the way through. Of course, detecting the modes is just one thing that we can do with that. Those vibrations are also going to give us valuable information about the materials that we're working with, right? So if we scrape this across a plastic surface versus a glass surface, we're obviously going to create very different vibrations. Similarly, when we bring that knife down, we're going to get different kinds of vibrations from the, depending on what kind of food item we have. And what we looked at is actually trying to identify the food items based on these vibrations. So we had these 25 different kinds of food items. And what we did is we took sort of always 0.1 second windows from when it's sort of going down and sort of first placing the knife on top of the food item. And we took some melt frequency Sepson coefficients. I can talk about those more later on if there's any questions about that. And we put it into a simple 3 fully connected layers multi-layer perceptron network. And we use that to classify these 25 different food classes. And we get a very accurate classification actually using this. So we have an F1 score of 0.99 out of 1. Here we can see all the errors that happen. So for example, it thought that a bread was an old tomato at one point. It's not using any vision here. So that can happen. Or a watermelon was a frozen lemon. Here we can see what this looks like in practice. So we provide the robot with different parameters based on each one of these classes. And so you can see that it's correctly classifying the carrot and it's using a faster sort of downward motion. Whereas with this old tomato, it's classified that as an old tomato. And so it's using a much more going down. By the way, if you're wondering what does it mean for something to be old, it means it's been in the fridge for 1 week. So that is the student definition of old vegetables. But we can also use this for vegetables and fruits that the robot's never seen before. So in this case, it doesn't know what a peach is, but it thinks that's a zucchini. And if you've ever sort of cut into an unripe peach, then that feels very similar. We do have, it doesn't know what a pear is, but it's sort of classified that as an apple. So those are obviously very related. My favorite one is, I think, this one down here. So, bell pepper, obviously very large green object. Jalapeno is a lot smaller and skinny, maybe a little bit more looking like a cucumber. But based on the vibrations, we know that actually, the sort of the cell structure of the bell pepper is a lot more similar to a jalapeno, and therefore it's classified those. So the message of this part is really to use vibrations because they provide a lot of information, both about the different contacts that we have there, as well as the kind of material that we're interacting with. Before I finish, I just want to thank all of my students who do all the work. I'd also like to thank the funding agencies for their support. And with that, I'm going to leave it over to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oliver. We really enjoyed the presentation and getting to hear from you about your work and such. So we have a series of questions that have come in on the technical side. I'll kick off with those. And then if we have time, I'd really like to ask some questions about your journey and path. So, okay, more and more technical questions are coming in. So I'll try to dive through those. So the first question was, how is the intervention picked? How is the intervention picked?
Okay, so I'm assuming this is for the causal reasoning. So for the interventions, we simply systematically right now go through pretty much every single context variable that we have, and we just change each one at a time. So this is all sort of done internally in the the robot's internal model. So it's fairly cheap to do that. In this case, we have been looking at sort of these kind of environments where we have quite a few blocks. It's obviously not as complicated as the real world. So in the real world, you would probably want to incorporate a little bit of prior knowledge about things like proximity and alignment. Mm-hmm. But also you probably want to sort of do a little bit more sort of group interventions, I would say. So, if there's a bunch of things on a shelf, if we just move the entire shelf, 5 meters to the side and it still works, then probably nothing in the shelf was important. So I would say there's definitely an open research question there about how to best select the kind of interventions. But at this scale we're working right now, we just do every single context variable individually.
Okay, great, thank you. Are you defining the task goals as input to the model for the robot to understand which blocks to grab?
Yes, so we effectively mark which one. So the internally there is a label like, okay, this is the 0 block, and then they're all sort of labeled, and the goal is to get like the 0 1 on the first one. So there is that sort of information in there. Yes.
Okay, and how did you choose the vibration detection method?
So the vibrations, I mean, I've been fascinated with vibrations for manipulation for a long time. They're very low cost, very effective tactile sensors. They're not sort of traditional tactile sensors, which give you like a force. But they have this nice property that they can, vibrations go through materials. So even if you're holding a tool, and you interact with something, you still get something on your tactile sensor rather than just a coarse force estimate. In terms of the actual method that we chose, so as I mentioned, one of the key parts of it, I would say, is these Mel frequency Sepson coefficients. So what these are is you effectively take your signal and you take your power spectrum of that, and then you treat that power spectrum as a signal of its own, and you take the power spectrum of that. So it's really the power spectrum of the power spectrum. So why is that important? So what it's doing is it's really trying to capture that harmonic structure inside of the signal. The best way to think about this is in terms of timbre. So the MFCCs have sometimes described as sort of capturing the timbre. So if you're listening to a brass instrument play a certain noise versus a woodwind instrument playing the same note, the differences in those sounds, those are really the timbre. And so these are sort of trying to capture something very similar, except that in this case, rather than woodwind and brass, we have bell pepper and lemon. But yeah, so it was the reason we go for vibrations, I would say, is taking inspiration from humans and the kind of vibration signals that we get from our fingertips or our skin in general, and then using insights from sort of frequency analysis for creating features. And then this is itself is a fairly simple three-layered multi-layer perceptron network.
Okay, some more about the vibrations. Would there be two different, this question has two parts. Would there be two different items having similar vibrations when cut? And what could the robot do if it gets two clashing classes of items?
So okay, okay, if there's two clashing items, so first of all, I would say that they are fairly distinct. So we can differentiate between like a frozen lemon versus a lemon, cucumber and an old cucumber. If they are sort of clashing, I would generally say that it's good to incorporate additional information then, right? You want to have some additional features that allow you to sort of separate between those. One might be to use vision, so maybe they are visually very distinct. Again, I would suggest thinking about actual like interactions. So we have also looked at sort of playing with food. So this is a kind of a hidden slide. So we looked at robots actually playing with different kinds of food. Again, collecting vibrations, video. Getting those different kinds of interactions provides additional perspectives on the food, and so effectively trying to gather more information as possible. So maybe you have to feel the object a little bit in your hand, but yeah. So I would suggest that's kind of the best way of approaching that. Here you can actually see some results that we looked at. So using these kind of interactions, you can actually really easily detect differences between objects in terms of boiled versus not boiled. So this is kind of representing a variety of different objects. The circles are sort of the non-boiled versions, the same color as these sort of kind of 3-point shapes is the boiled ones. I always love this plot just because so we're learning this kind of representation using these vibration signals. And you can see really nice patterns in here. So for example, we have these things, the pears and the apples. So the pink and the yellow, they're fairly close to each other. And also when we boil them, they stay really close to each other. We also have the carrots and the potatoes, which are initially kind of distinct, but when you boil them, they actually move closer together, right? And that's kind of also intuition that, when you've boiled potatoes and carrots for a few minutes, they do actually get a more similar consistency. So yeah, definitely go for more features. I would say in many cases, adding vibrations is actually something that you could use to help differentiate between different similar situations, especially if vision's not working that well.
Someone was asking about human-robot interaction safety. So is there current research to leverage the observed material vibrations for human-robot interaction safety?
That's an excellent question. So usually when I have a HRI question, I go sort of to my next door neighbor, my next door office neighbor, Henia Admoni, and ask her. So we've been talking about sort of how to use vibrations for HRI. I'm assuming that there is probably some work in there, but I don't know to what extent, like how extensive it is.
How are you defining task goals as input to the model for the robot to understand which blocks to grab? I think you talked about that a little bit. But
yes. So
add there.
So we do have this sort of like a reward function in there. So in this case, it is like a certain location for every single context. So the distance from where the block is to where it should be, I think it was a quadratic reward function. For this one, it was really just the angle of the crate door. So, define based on that angle. The defining reward functions, getting those reward functions from, just sort of the robot's own sensors, that's definitely an ongoing research area. So yes, it's an excellent question. So yeah, it's the position of the block that we're placing and the angle of the door.
What happens if, does deformed or damaged food affect the food classification significantly?
That is an excellent question. We've definitely deformed quite a lot of food. I mean, you can already see it here a little bit for the old tomato. So the grasping of the object, sometimes, trying to get that very sturdy grip of the object that can deform it. I don't think we saw any significant effects of that from the vibration side. Obviously, if you are playing with food, then you are going to sort of, see some major deformation. So here you can see, oops. So this was like I said, we had this other project where we're playing with food, picking it up, dropping it, squishing it. And you can see that the change here. I don't think there was a significant change in the vibrations. They seem to be generally quite robust to that. Although we do have the data set available for this online. So if anyone wants to explore that further, I think that'd be a great research problem.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, there's more questions coming in. I'm trying to
Okay.
we're keeping you on your toes. Do you perform 3D object reconstruction before proceeding to exact relevant features?
Oh, so it depends a lot on the project, I would say. So for example, I think for this one, I think we didn't do full reconstruction. We just did top down sort of bounding boxes, and I think we took the height of the object based on the point cloud. For some of these, we did do some sort of localization. Some obviously we have pre-provided the models. During my postdoc and my PhD, I did quite a bit of work on trying to sort of estimate models from a single perspective. So often, you can create a fairly crude model just by taking the points that you observe, looking sort of down, and just projecting them down into the table to create a full 3D volume. It's not perfect, but in many cases, it's sufficient, right? And I would say that that's kind of also in line with this kind of use of an internal model. So I think we have to be careful about relying on internal models that are very accurate, rely on very accurate object information. And often it's sort of better to have a coarser model that's more readily available and use that to sort of structure the problem, allowing, relying on the real world to give you a lot of those details as you need them. But sort of, using that coarse model to sort of narrow down the scope so you are focusing on learning the relevant parts.
And we just have 5 minutes left, and
Okay.
one of the questions that came in is perfect because it segues us into your educational journey and research. Could you talk to us a little bit about your background? How did you first become interested in this field? And the specific question was like, how did you get to the point where you're studying manipulation and learning? So maybe you could bring us earlier on in the journey.
I mean, so it's been a long journey. I think I started really getting interested in robotics when I was very young, like 5 years old. My parents had like toy robots, and I was super excited about them. I remember, I did my bachelor's and master's in engineering. Turns out I was not actually great at robotics. I remember it was actually robotics and computer vision was one of my lowest grades, but I was very passionate about it. So, just keep pushing for it. In terms of manipulation and learning, I feel like that's one of those areas you kind of also just fall into if you never really specialize. So manipulation and learning, one of the great things about this area is that it is just super wide. So, there's so many different aspects about it. For me, manipulation is really just about changing the state of the world, trying to have robots creating a better world in some way. And learning is really just about having that adaptivity in there. I don't think everything needs to be learning. We have a lot of great AI methods like planning methods and stuff like that. So, as I mentioned, finding the right scope for the learning is very important. But for me, yeah, learning was just about that adaptiveness. And I think one of the great things about it is because it is so general, is that it's fantastic for also collaborations. So I always like to say that I'm a kind of a universal collaborator. There's very few people that that aren't going to intersect in some way their research with manipulation or with learning. And so I think it's a very general kind of area to be in. So I definitely encourage other people to follow and join. Join's a better word.
There are so I think so many of us on this call and watching and participating right now are thinking about next steps, right? And many have are in undergraduate STEM programs. It could be engineering, it could be computer science, it could be statistics, and they're trying to really chart that path forward. Do you have some words of wisdom, some experiences like don't do this, in planning for next steps as they try to go forward and think about getting ready for graduate school?
So I would first of all say that there is no one specific path. As John said, I also help with the MRSD sort of applications, and one of the things I love about that is just seeing how many different kinds of backgrounds, how many different ways people have explored robotics through projects, through more formal things, through internships, and just there is no you need to do this in order to succeed. There's many ways to succeed, I would say. In general, any kind of hands-on experience with robotics, I think is very valuable. I'm always excited when people do have some hands-on experience because there is always that first step, which is kind of the or that first hurdle, I would say, of working with real robots, where you realize they are very difficult to work with sometimes. Some days they'll just stop working and you'll spend a day debugging. And I think having that passion there. And making sure that robotics is something that you want to do. I think that's the critical thing. So getting some real world experience is always very useful. Some software, some coding experience is also very useful. Some the basics. I think just kind of think about what kind of areas you want to be focusing on. I think that's important. Also, just for building up that tapping into that passion. I think that's really an important part. But yeah,
We have one more question that might wrap us up nicely. I know we're at 11:30, but if you have just a few moments to answer, this question is, in thinking about preparing and those next steps, what kind of, what are the software platforms that they should be familiar with? And specifically, they were asking, like, what kind of softwares are you using to perform your experiments? And do you use RISS, Python, or are there other platforms? If they have time to, really build some skill and experience, what are the software and the platforms that you would suggest?
Oh, this is, yeah, I think this is something that John and I have been discussing quite a bit lately. I definitely feel like Python and C++ are good ways to go in terms of software. Having a basic understanding of ROS is very useful. My lab uses a bit of ROS, not as heavily as one might expect, but that is a very useful skill to know, and getting familiar with some of the libraries like Move It for motion planning. Yeah. So yeah, I would say C++ and Python are good software starting points.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. Oliver, it was really a joy to kick off with you. Thank
Thanks for
you
having me.
for the opportunity to do so. So thank you.